So how is everybody doing today? Glad that you are here with us. My voice is a little funky today, so I might ask you to kind of bear with me at some times. And I'm glad that you are here because we are continuing a series we began last week looking at some of the stranger things in the Bible, and there are a bunch of them. Last week we began by looking at an axe head that God caused to float. Today we're going to look at somebody who wrestles with God. And what in the world would that have to do with people like us? Just before we jump into that message for today, I want to give you an update. Last week, I let you know that we had a team that was going to enter the Weber County Jail, and we've been looking to get in there for a long time to bring some hope and some help and some relationships with the people who are there. Last Tuesday was the first evening when that happened, and just want to let you know some 40 people showed up for that and were a part of that. And let me just say, to those of you that are there, you are a part of us, and we are honored to have you. Thank you for joining us. So today, a runner turned wrestler. And, I think in any story in the Bible, some of them are pretty short, some are pretty longer. And today we're going to take a look at a longer story. And I want to begin by prepping us with three key elements that play out in this story. And so the first one is this, that a name equals your identity. And in the Old Testament, you see this over and over again. A name for us doesn't mean a whole lot beyond name that we like. We like the sound of it. We like how the first name goes with the last name. And for us, it isn't really all that much about meaning or identity, but it was then. And we're going to see that play out in this story. I had, a little bit of an experience with my own name not that long ago, my last name. Now, if you know anything about the ride service Uber, it has kind of revolutionized the whole taxi industry and all of that. And so the time came for me to set up an account for myself, a username, and so I wanted to use Roy Gruber because that is my name, so I wanted to use that as my username. And when I tried to sign on, there is, a similarity there, and it said that my name could not be accepted. I don't know if they thought I was trying to be them or something, and I just want to let Uber know, I had that name long before you ever came up with that name, but I am officially Roy and the letter G, and that worked, but my actual name didn't. In this story, you're going to see somebody's name have so much to do with somebody's identity. Who they are, their character, their nature, what they are all about. Second important part that plays out in this story is something called the birthright. And the birthright has to do with position, authority. It has to do with influence. And here's how it worked. The firstborn son would be the one who would receive the birthright. And the birthright gave you authority over the family. You could make a lot of the important decisions. You had more influence. When it came to an inheritance, you received 2/3 of it. The rest would divide whatever was left over. And, I think even today we recognize that there's some dynamics around birth order, right? So let me see who we got in the room here. How many people here are the firstborn? You're the oldest in your family? Yeah, these are the responsible ones, the leaders, blah, 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 blah. Say the rest of us. How many people are somewhere in the middle of the birth order? Are there any hands raised? Because middle children go through life pretty much invisible, and so they can't be seen. And the oldest ones are kind of famous for saying, hey, we write the rules. The middle ones are the ones who are famous for saying, we're the reason that we have rules because of what we do and who we are. How many youngest children are there in the room? And I am one of you, and that explains a lot, doesn't it? It's just kind of the irresponsible one who just, if they say, we write the rules, we're the reason we have rules, the youngest says, they don't apply to me. And I'm going to do pretty much whatever I want to do. And in this story, we're going to have a firstborn and a secondborn son. They're born in very close proximity to each other. But this issue is going to play a huge role in this story. Who has the birthright? Who has the authority? Who has the influence? Another part of this story that's really important for us to know is something called blessing. And this was a tradition in Bible times where a father would often pronounce these words of affirmation and direction over the life, most of the time, of his oldest child, his oldest son. And this was a sense of direction. It was words of encouragement in that direction to live out that prediction of what life would entail. All three of these will show up. So let's jump into the story. And as I mentioned, this is a longer story. And so I want to tell you a little bit of the story before we get to the passage that we're going to look at here, where somebody wrestles with God. And I'll just say this as we get started, that if you come from a messed up family, either the one that you grew up in or the one that you're a part of now or your extended family, whatever the case might be, chances are you're going to feel better about your family after this story, because there are some messed up people. Dysfunction is nothing new, and we're going to see that on full display. The mom and the dad, their names are Isaac and Rebekah. And Rebekah gives birth to twin boys. The oldest one, his name is Esau, and the younger one, born immediately after, his name is Jacob. And a strange thing when these boys are born, because the second one, Jacob, when he comes out, he's grasping at the heel of his older brother, who just began life on the outside before him. And his name is called Jacob, and it has a same sound as heel in the Hebrew language, but it also means grasper. We could even put into the whole arena taker, a usurper, a supplanter, somebody who takes from another what is not theirs. And along with that name, over time, comes this sense of identity. And in Jacob, we find somebody who's going to play out this scenario. He becomes a taker, a deceiver. He becomes somebody who lives out the identity that was given to him right from his first day. And what happens in this family is that mom and dad are divided in their affection over their two children. And parents, if you want to mess up your kids, one of the best ways to do that is just be overt and outright about your favoritism of one child over another. Now, I'm convinced that every child that has ever walked the face of this earth, this one included, feels like mom and dad love somebody else more. But there are times in which that is not made up, and when that happens, the outcome of that can be catastrophic. So dad, Isaac, loves Esau. And Esau, we find out, is a man's man. And he's a hunter and a fisherman. And if he's going to go shopping, you're going to run into him at Cabela's. And that's where he loves to hang out. Well, Jacob, the second born, he's a little bit more of, a homebody. And he stays around the camp. And if you're going to run into him shopping, you'll find him at Bed Bath & Beyond. And, of course, that was in the times before Amazon, put everybody else out of business. And the preference of one parent to a child over another begins to play out in this dynamic in some serious, serious ways. One day, Esau comes in from hunting, and he is absolutely famished. And he wants something to eat. And Jacob, who is a taker and a deceiver, comes up with this idea and says, hey, I'll tell you what, I'll make your favorite dish, but it's going to cost you something. You know what it's going to cost you? It's going to cost you your birthright. You were born first. You have the influence and the authority. Jacob doesn't like that all that much. And for some reason, Esau says, okay. Now, on one level, I'm thinking, why would somebody ever do that? Maybe that stew contains some brisket, because that's pretty tempting, when it comes to what you're willing to give up for it. But the more we think about that, put it in these terms. You ever seen anybody who trades what is good in the long term for something that is immediate in the moment? And I think we know that happens. And so on that day, Jacob gets what wasn't his, but something that he desired, something that he wanted. And we see this pattern begin to be set in motion in Jacob's life. Years later, when Isaac is very, very old, he wants to bestow this blessing upon his firstborn son, upon Esau, upon the son that he loves. And Rebekah, the mom, hears that this is going to take place, and she's on Jacob's team. And so she gets Jacob and alerts him to this, and together they concoct this plan whereby Jacob is going to dress up like Esau because now Isaac's eyesight is failing. He's virtually blind. So if you feel like him and you smell like him, you will be able to fool him, and you can get the blessing. And he puts on this goat hair kind of suit because we hear that Esau is a hairy man. Apparently, this guy had the body hair of Sasquatch. And so Jacob puts that on and comes in, and Isaac can't see, but he reaches out and he feels, feels like Esau. And he's wearing some of his clothes, smells like Esau, but the voice is more like Jacob. What is your name? He asked him. And Jacob says, it's Esau. And Isaac goes ahead and gives him the blessing. And Jacob leaves, and he has once again taken something that was intended for someone else. Through deception, through scheming, Esau comes in to receive his blessing because he was aware that it was about to be given as well. And when he sits down and the father and the son figure out, the blessing's already been given. I thought it was you. It wasn't me. It was your brother. And Esau says, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill him. So what's a guy to do who's pulled off the scheme, but now all of a sudden the jig is up? He runs. He takes off. Thinks, well, if my life's in jeopardy, getting out of town. He runs away to one of his uncles by the name of Laban. And Laban has big flocks of goats, and he also has a couple of daughters. And when Jacob shows up, he lays eyes on one of those daughters. Her name is Rachel, and he is smitten. He is head over heels in love. And he wants to marry her. Well, Laban says, we have this custom here where we are that you have to work 7 years for someone's hand in marriage. And so if you'd like to work 7 years, we can work that out. And Jacob says, okay. And in some of the more interesting words in all the Bible, there's a verse that says, and to Jacob, it was as if those 7 years were just a day. There'll be a Hallmark movie to that effect coming out sometime in the future. It's like, So 7 years is up, and the marriage takes place, and the ceremony happens, and the wedding night happens, and then the next morning comes, and in the King James Version, when Jacob wakes up and looks over at his bride, it says, and lo, it was Leah. Leah's the older sister, not Rachel. And I don't pretend to know how all of that happened, but it sounds like there were copious amounts of alcohol involved in that whole experience there, because when there are copious amounts of alcohol, a lot of outcomes are not what we would expect and not good. And Jacob gets up and he goes to his new father-in-law. He says, hey, I worked for Rachel, not for Leah. And Laban goes, oh, did I forget to tell you that we have this custom here that the oldest sister is always married off first? It must have slipped my mind. And so the deceiver just got deceived. And when that happens, deceivers don't like it very much. But he says, oh, but you know what? I'll tell you what. You work another 7 years, and then you can have Rachel. And he does. And by the end of that time, Jacob has a pile of kids. And he's entered the whole goat industry that his uncle Laban has been carrying out so well. He's become wealthy. He has what so many people look for in that time, especially in this world. And you would think, all is well. Not so much. Because your character will ultimately play out anywhere, anytime. So what Jacob does over the period of time is he's directly responsible for the whole breeding of the goat herds, and he's just very subtly manipulates that in his direction so that he gets the best goats, and his uncle Laban, he doesn't get nothing, but he gets the less good goats out of that whole thing. And so over a period of time, Jacob becomes really wealthy, and his uncle less so. But then one day, his uncle figures it out, and once again, the jig is up. And Jacob's about to take off and run once again, but they have this face-to-face meeting where they draw a line in the sand, literally. They say, hey, let's put a boundary here. I'm not coming in that direction. You don't go in that direction. Let's just kind of go our separate ways here. And so Jacob leaves there, and he sure can't go back there. Well, where's the guy to go? And he really has nowhere left. So he turns his direction back home. And God gives him some direction to go back home as well. But you remember what his brother said right before he left? I'm going to kill him. So what can he expect years later from the brother who swore that he would take his life because of what was taken from him? So Jacob is making his way back home. And he does something that, again, is kind of ingenious. He decides to send some gifts ahead. He's got this whole entourage. He's a man of some pretty incredible means by now. And he sends these gifts ahead to soften the heart of his brother. Maybe it'll kind of calm him down, temper whatever anger is left over there. And when those people that he sends out to deliver those gifts come back, they say, oh, Esau is marching out to meet you. And he's got an army of 400 men with him. Whenever you're going to meet an army led by a guy who said he was going to kill you, that doesn't sound like it's going to end very well. And so Jacob wonders, wow, what do I do now? So here's what he does. And this is such a tremendous insight into this man's character and nature. He's got this entourage of people and all these children, and he divides them into two camps. And he hangs behind them. And the thinking goes like this. Well, if that army led by Esau, my brother, attacks one of those groups, I will join the other and we'll take off. And if they attack the other one, I'll join that one and we'll take off. But I'm hanging back because I'm going to be safe. And you know who we are in terms of identity will find its way wherever we find ourselves. And so that night, he's going to meet his brother the next day. All those people are divided into two camps. He's behind. Here's where this passage unfolds. Genesis chapter 24. This left Jacob all alone in the camp, and a man came and wrestled with him until the dawn began to break. When the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. Then the man said, let go of me, for the dawn is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. What is your name? The man asked. He replied, Jacob. Your name will no longer be Jacob, the man told him. From now on, you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won. Please tell me your name, Jacob said. Why do you want to know my name? The man replied. Then he blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place Peniel, which means face of God, for he said, I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared. Who is this man who comes to wrestle with Jacob? And commentators are pretty unanimous in agreement when it comes to the identity of that person. That this is an Old Testament appearance of none other than Jesus. The one who is eternal, who from time to time, especially not just at strategic and important points in a person's life, but in the whole playing out of what God is seeking to do in this world to bring redemption and hope to a broken and dark world, makes an appearance. And we think, wow, somebody would wrestle with God, that's strange. What does that story have to do not just with Jacob, but with you and me? Let's figure that out in the form of 3 questions. And so let me ask you these one at a time. What is the real blessing? All of his life, Jacob's been after it. He made it happen, sometimes with the help of others, sometimes he did it himself, and he has been looking for something, and he was willing to take even what was not his in the hope that he would get that blessing. I wonder, even if on that night, what Jacob was hoping for when that wrestling match began was some help with the circumstances that he was facing. Look, I can't go back. My uncle's back there, and he shut that door. And I got my brother in front of me. He swore to kill me, and I can understand why he would. God, would you smooth out all these circumstances and make tomorrow okay? But here's the thing about that encounter and that story. He never gets any assurances about the next day. He's never told that he's going to survive the next day. But he does say something very telling about that encounter. Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, I have seen God face to face. Probably for the first time in his life, Jacob has a personal encounter with God. He grew up hearing about who God was, because you know who Jacob's grandfather was? A guy by the name of Abraham, and maybe you've heard that name. And it was to Abraham first that God came and said, you know what? We're going to go to work, and I'm going to create a nation, and ultimately there will be someone, a Messiah who will come, and we're going to restore and redeem this broken world. And that was passed down from generation to generation, and no doubt Jacob had heard about all those promises. And yet still, maybe because he just lived with an awareness of God and not a personal relationship with God, that his life played out by him trying to manipulate and manufacture and bring together his resources to bring out the outcomes that he longed to see. And so many of that was focused in his own direction. I'm going to get a blessing, even if I have to cheat and steal and lie to get it. But everything changes on this night. And all of a sudden, he knows there's a real God. Met with him face to face. And so much changes in that moment, because maybe in that instant we realize, you know what, there's somebody much greater than me at work here. And it's not up to me to try to make things happen, but rather there is a God who is with me and for me, who has made promises to me. And maybe I can live in light of that rather than to try to deceive and take what is not mine. So what's the real blessing? See, many of us, we might view God like he's some version of a lucky rabbit's foot, like he's a genie in the bottle. And we might draw close because we want to see him take care of the difficult circumstances that we face. And sometimes he does. And sometimes he doesn't. And we may wonder, well, what's up with that? Why would God not do what he could do every time? This story tells us, like many others, that God is much more committed to my character than he is committed to my comfort. And truth be told, many times what we seek is comfort, but what God offers us is the power to transform our character. Why would God touch somebody and put his hip out of socket? Why do that? Think of it this way. From that night on, the man who's run and run and run, he couldn't run anymore. And he spent the rest of his days walking with a limp. But he walked with a limp inside of a relationship with a God who was out to transform somebody. It began in that moment. And so if we're looking for a God who's the God of comfort, we may have to go somewhere else, because the God of the Bible is committed to our character, to giving us a new sense of identity and direction for our lives. Which really leads us into the next question: what is your true identity? All kinds of different ways we try to figure that out here in this life. And we can spend a lot of our days working hard and trying to get a bank account that validates our identity, that gets a lifestyle that tells us that in some way, shape, or form we've arrived here. We may live in light of what others have said about us, letting somebody else determine what our identity is. There's another option, and that is to let God determine your identity. And that's one of the curious things that happens in this, and it seems like one of those details that, why is that there? But he's asked this question, and this is a powerful moment. What's your name? The man asked him. And you know why that's important? Because all those years earlier, when he put on the goat jacket to go deceive his father, he was asked the question, what is your name? And he lied. Oh, it's Esau. He's asked that same question all these years later. What's your name? And on this day, he tells the truth. Jacob. This is who I am. And I wonder if it was the first time ever that Jacob thought, you know what? I got nowhere else to go. All I can do is be honest. And do you notice what God does immediately in response to that? He changes his name. And on the other side of one man's honesty, Jacob, the deceiver, the taker, becomes Israel, the one who knows that there is a God who fights, there is a God who prevails, a God who wins. And now I'm with him. But it's no longer the broken me who's making the decisions, who's making the calls. I wonder if you've ever understood how God feels about you and how God would identify you. Because here what we often do is we work it really hard to try to create some image of ourselves, some reputation, some identity. But there's a God who was willing to die for you, so that you are treasured. You're of that much value to him. You can be an adopted child of his. You can belong to him. And there is so much power in those moments when we get honest with things and we simply stop running and we start getting real. And maybe you've seen this in a 12-step meeting if you've ever been there. Maybe you've seen it portrayed in TV or movies. Somebody gets up and says, my name is, and then they say what they're dealing with, what they're struggling with. And even here on Tuesday nights, something called Celebrate Recovery. It's focused on Jesus' 12-step group based on biblical principles. And every time a leader gets up, they say, my name is, and they say what it is that they're dealing with. And there is something incredibly powerful about an honest and truthful confession about ourselves. And on the other side of that moment, Jacob is not a perfect man, but he's a different man. And the trajectory of his life that led him over and over again in the direction of deception and deceit now begins to move in a different direction. And it doesn't happen overnight, but he's a different man. Began by God changing his identity from who he was all by himself to who he was in a relationship with the God who had been there his whole life. But maybe it was just an idea, but it finally become personal. One more question. Where are you going? Where's the trajectory of your life taking you? And we may wonder with Jacob, well, how did it end? You know, if that was that moment and we see all of those earlier years, how did it end for him? And we've got a little bit of a snapshot. In the New Testament, there's a book called Hebrews. And in Hebrews chapter 11, if God has a hall of fame when it comes to faith, that's it. And it lists all these different people and all the things that God did through them. You know who makes the hall of fame for faith? Jacob. And he's not called Israel there, he's called Jacob there, which is interesting too. But if we want to know, how did his story end? Where did his trajectory now take him? Here's what it says. It was by faith that Jacob, when he was old and dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and bowed in worship as he leaned on his staff. That's all it says about him. But somebody in their final days was a different person than they were in their earlier days. And I wonder if the one who had been the recipient of favoritism now is doing something very different. I'm not just going to bless one, I'm going to bless them all. And the thing that I was willing to take, I will freely give to others. It's a different guy. And you and I, we cannot go back and change the beginning. But with God's help, we can begin where we are, and we can change the ending. It can be different. And it doesn't happen overnight, and it's not always easy, and sometimes it can become quite a challenge. But we can change the ending. What does all of this really teach us about who God is and what it means to be in a relationship with Him? When you finally stop running, start following. There's a God who's been there the whole time. And He's been working it, looking for some blessing that you thought would come through something and some circumstance in your life. The real blessing is the God who loves you with an everlasting love. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes along with Him. But it isn't even about that. It's about Him and His desire to meet you personally. And if you've been living out a certain identity or been trying to create it for yourself, let God determine your identity, because He thinks enough of you to come to this broken world and die for you so that you could belong to Him. That's how much you matter to Him. And where are you going? Where's your life taking you? And you think, well, I've had all these strikes, I got all this history behind me, that's just who I am. That may be who you are all by yourself. But with God, it's different. And you can set a new course. You can be transformed by the power and by the grace of the God who loves you. Because the reality is, He knows all about you. He knows all the things that we did, who we've become, where we've gone, all of it. And He loves us anyway. And He offers you, and He offers me Himself. I'm going to invite you to bow your heads together with me as I pray. God, we thank You for who You are, for being a God who loves us in spite of ourselves. And Jacob's story, in so many ways, it's the story of mankind. It's our story. That God, these hearts of ours, they strive and hunger for certain things, and we go in all kinds of different directions to find it. But I think of somebody hundreds of years ago who said it so well, that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in You. And thank You that that relationship is always available to us. Thank You that we can get honest, come clean with the God who's seen it all, knows it all, but invites us to trust Him. So God, we thank You for Your goodness and Your grace to us on this day. Thank You for this time together. And we thank You for the difference that You make, that these hearts of ours can be made over, that the future need not look like the past. And that's because of You. So lead us on together with You, we ask and pray. In Jesus' name, amen.